Thanks for having me on, Adam. Yeah, my name's Ed Bond. I work for Robert Bird Group. I'm coming up to 20 years in the industry, which is making me feel a bit old. um, but it's been good because I've been quite lucky kind of in my career to date because I've been able to kind of move around in different regions and experience as well different economic shocks, which have really helped kind of grow my experience. I've been in the UK, Leeds originally, where I was born, and I kind of worked in London. I was in the Middle East for a couple of years, and then I came to Melbourne 4.5 years ago. So that's helped me just give a help me understand a bit of a different perspective on where the industry sat, in those different regions, and bringing kind of new ideas as well with me to the Australian market. I'm quite a big advocate of more sustainable design, I guess. What does that mean anymore? It's a bit overused kind of slogan because it's quite broad. From a I'm a structural engineer, I guess, to add by trade. So I think recently the focus has been very much on embodied carbon in terms of what a structural engineer can present and help change the industry moving forward and kind of reduce the impact on global warming. There's more to it than that in terms of planetary breakdown. There's kind of warming seas. There's water pollution, air pollution. There's all kinds of other aspects which are causing breakdown, I guess, of biodiversity. But we generally like to oversimplify things. So I think at the moment, it's difficult to comprehend all that. The real industry focus is embodied carbon. I think to put things in perspective, I just kind of woke up to the news this morning and I could see New York's got some of the worst air pollution in the world at the moment because of forest fires out in the northeast of North America. And it's really hammering home at the moment how important it is for everyone to make some pretty drastic changes with the way they go about it. Melbourne, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, had some of the worst air quality, in the world because of forest fires as well. So, this is something that's changed, very much over the past few years, but it's only changed really because everyone's been kind of shaken out of their denial because it's very real now. We're seeing the effects. There's been a lot of flooding over the past year, and these are things that are really starting to take effect, the changes and the impact from a warming planet. And so I think the industry is responding to that. And there has been, since I've been in Australia 4.5 years, there's been some rapid developments, in this kind of raising in terms of profile. And there's greater awareness. Legislation hasn't fully changed, but there's accreditation coming through, and we're starting to think about calculating embodied carbon, and there's a lot more talk about it. It's not business as usual, where my business, Robert Bird Group, we have offices, just to set a bit of context, primarily within Australia where we were founded, offices in New Zealand, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and North America. And Europe seemed to be a bit ahead, not miles ahead, but we kind of use that to look at trends as well of what's happening there. And we are starting to see a demand from our clients as well. And I think the industry, to some extent, is kind of leading the way forward on that. There's accreditations out there. I think the main ones which people who dial into this will probably be aware of is Green Star, which is predominantly the leader when it comes to buildings in terms of a Green Star rating, with the top rating being 6 stars. And the infrastructure, we have a presence as well in that sector, and that's the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, that's ISCA. They're probably the 2 main leading bodies, but there's other kind of spin-offs. There's NABERS, which is kind of energy related. There's Climate Active, which is related to business offsets. Because it's an emerging topic, there's going to be more accreditations, and kind of it's a changing landscape, and it does actually make things quite confusing. As an example, there's up to 6 stars with NABERS. With NABERS, there's 6 stars. With NATERS or NABERS, depending how you pronounce it, it goes up to 10 stars. Green Star's got an upper cap at 6 stars. So it's really difficult to kind of understand, what your rating is, because generally, 5 stars are top rating, so you think you're getting that, and it might end up being quite a low score depending on which system you're looking at. So it doesn't help. And I think there's still a lot of learning and understanding going on. I've been kind of tracking it relatively closely. I'm trying to lead it within Victoria and nationally, within our business. And there's just an education, across how we go about it, and because it naturally, I think this to some extent is why there has been so much kind of inactivity and maybe initial denial. It's just I think there's frustration, but it's a complicated topic, the warming planet, it's not necessarily tangible. And then how you start calculating it within a building sense, it's highly complex, and it really goes beyond what we were initially kind of educated to do at university, in terms of our training. And because it is so complicated, I was going back to the simplification of embodied carbon being, the only target, when there's other things that we need to really be aware of in terms of looking after the planet. But we've kind of done the same just to really get things started, which is understandable with how we are calculating embodied carbon. It's very much focused at the front end, which is kind of more the production stage. And so there's kind of stages A1 to A3. And that's really the materials before it gets to site. So it's kind of almost kind of the wished in place structure. A4 to A5 is the construction stage. So it's kind of transportation to site and the build emissions. Then you have kind of the user stage, which is the operational carbon, just kind of heating, cooling the building. Then there's the end of life stage, which could be demolition, which is C. And then there's kind of the reuse or recycling, which is the end stage, D. All of these have different connotations really on the selection of A1 to A3. So it's a start, but it's not quite right as a system. You really need to be looking at the whole life cycle, which I kind of just described. But at the moment, we are calculating A1 to A3. So we're kind of really understanding as a business as well, because Robert Bird Group, we look at construction methodology. That's initially how we started. So we look to embed that in our design, and A4 to A5 talks to that. So we're actually looking at those stages, which can make quite a big difference. Long span structures, more complex load path structures, that embodied carbon in terms of, say, primary structural frame could be up at, say, 40%. So it could be a significant number if you look at sports stadia and just more unusual structures. Typically, it's about 10 to 15%. So there's some approximations out there that you can apply to get the A1 to A5, which in Europe is now kind of a bit of a default approach to capture all the construction stages to the final building.
Yeah.
So I think that's one part of it, but we're at the moment just primarily focusing on A1 to A3 and just kind of calculating how that works. There is legislation change coming, which I think will help, rather than having different accreditations where people can take different routes, and it's difficult to compare apples with apples. The NCC, which is the National Construction Code, there's an update coming in 2025. So it's in a couple of years away, and that will set embodied carbon targets. So that's going to be a bit of a game changer. And that means all buildings will really have to sign up to that legislation, and it really stops it from being just kind of this one-off exceptional case. Something probably just to emphasize here, if you do want to go for a Green Star rating or an ISCA rating, you have to pay for that privilege. It's a significant amount of money. So, if there's no incentive there to do it, certain developers aren't going to pay for that money. That there's prestige that comes with it, and that's the other kind of emerging trend, that some developers are kind of looking further ahead at an asset they own, and it partially comes down to, are you going to own and manage the asset, or are you going to try and flip that and sell it immediately? If it's the latter, then there's less incentive to try and get these accreditations. If you're thinking long term as an asset, then there's an incentive to get the accreditation. However, with legislation change, it would mean that all buildings have to follow an approach which really kind of calculates embodied carbon and tries to reduce it. So I can only see that as a real positive going forward.
That 2025, Ed, so that's like, is that when it's coming in, or are the conversations starting then, or is it literally in the NCC 2025 there's going to be some reporting side, or do you have any more on that?
There will be data given. There'll be targets given on ranges, which is potentially going to be quite controversial, because we're talking about in the immediate. But if you start putting this into context of reducing emissions by 2030 by 50%, then that obviously has to happen.
Yeah.
So it's happening, which is really positive.
It is, yeah. And you need that leadership from the public's side to drive it. And then hopefully there's the innovation within all supply chains. I'm sure timber is just one part of the solution, but maybe that's my next question to you, Ed. Like, in what ways are the structural engineers able to actually cater on these demands coming from the NCC, and how is the role of the structural engineer sort of going to evolve in light of these targets?
Yeah, I think we're going to have a leading role. I mean, some of the messaging I've been trying to get out to industry is that we're not always there in the first kind of decision-making process of projects. We could be a little bit of an afterthought, that as an architectural lead on maybe what a building looks like in terms of grids, layouts, materiality, and when you look at the overall embodied carbon picture, you've got maybe 50 to 60% of that embodied carbon sat within the primary frame. As buildings evolve, historically, most of the embodied carbon sat in operational carbon. So it's kind of the heating and cooling, maintenance. Well, with the efficiency improvements and better air tightness, heat recovery, decarbonisation of the grid, it's going to shift and almost flip, where a lot of the embodied carbon is sat in the primary frame, which means that if we are to hit these targets, the structural engineer needs to have a seat at the table and needs to really start understanding, from initial concept, how to reduce embodied carbon on a project, and what levers can you pull. And I guess this is a timber talk kind of themed podcast, and I do genuinely believe that timber, which is regenerative material, and can sequester carbon, during the growth phase. If it's, I guess one of the most important things on all this, though, it has to be done sustainably, and I think a big thing that needs to move through the industry quicker is kind of specifications, quality assurance in terms of governance on where materials are coming from. And that's really key, to make sure things are done appropriately. And so I think on that front, the timber, it's a lightweight material, it's relatively strong. And it can be a very effective tool at reducing embodied carbon. It has some low numbers. There's a bit of debate, if we're honest, about the carbon data, and it goes back to what I was just talking about before of life cycle versus A1 to A3. But if you do look at it on an A1 to A3 basis, and which it's very low because you allow for the sequestration, so it's a negative number. So it's the best material, in terms of availability and what's on the table. I think, as you'll probably be aware of timber buildings, you dealt with the timber buildings that kind of we're looking at the moment or delivering. There's generally a bit of a hybrid, it's not purely timber. You have a reinforced concrete subbase. Taller buildings, you might have a hybrid with steel. I personally think that's the future, where we kind of just blend materials, get the most out of them. Concrete's great in the ground, it's very durable. Steel's strong, lightweight, stability cores, typically a concrete, because you need to house your lifts and stairs. One of the buildings we are looking at the moment is a steel exoskeleton, in the London market, which has proven, because we're engaging the outer face, and we have larger lever arms to be very efficient in terms of embodied carbon. But I think there's a nice hybrid there, and it's just getting the most out of materials. And as we speak, I'm involved in a carbon calculator, which really just tries to look at the changing landscape on materials, and it is pretty fascinating. And I think, in terms of the structure engineer, what can they do? What we're trying to do is understand what's coming next with decarbonisation of the grid, changes to plant. One example of that would be a timber mill, using kind of electricity from a renewable source. And that could apply to any of the plants. And decarbonisation, which is going to come in the future and is coming pretty quickly, which means that number could shift. What I'm getting told, some suppliers, that if they're able to source their energy 100% from renewables, it could reduce the number by 67% in terms of embodied carbon, whatever it is now. So things can change quickly. In terms of the data, Australia probably isn't that well placed, compared with, say, Europe, which is probably the global leader. However, things are changing very quickly. I think Australia has an opportunity to be a global leader, and from what I understand, what's happening in the market is there's been a really high take up of renewables, and decarbonisation is happening really quickly, to the point where, by 2030, say, that 50%, Australia could be in a world leading position, just because the amount of land, access to regular sunlight, means that there's an opportunity for things to really change. So I think you need to keep abreast of data, carbon data, as it's changing. Almost as engineers, we're kind of looking ahead, looking at the present. When's the building going to be constructed? Is it 3 years, 5 years from now? What's available now? Talk to the suppliers, get a handle on emerging trends. There's changes in strength of material, and bring that all together. It's a bit. I think one of your questions that maybe you asked me kind of before we started this conversation was, what's the structural engineer going to do in the future? And as I'm talking now, you can see the roles rapidly expanding. So that's quite a big ask. But at the same time, I guess the big motivation for myself, and I imagine for a lot of the structural engineers out there, with this changing landscape in terms of a warming planet, we actually have this really fortunate, I'd say, opportunity to improve things and make a genuine difference beyond, say, your own footprint. Significantly high. You could be talking on a project hundreds of thousands of tons of embodied carbon you could change by an optimization of, say, subbing in a different material, reducing the grid, taking out some transfers. So I really use that as motivation. And what I'm hoping to do, within my own business and hopefully further afield is using that to get people, to really try and find those extra savings, that improved kind of alignment, shortening the load path to be able to have a positive impact, on the industry and the planet ultimately.
Yeah, well, it's crazy, right? Like for a structural engineer, if you can take your bags to Coles to save on plastic, and we can do all these things as individuals, but as you said, when you actually map that onto like the change you can make as a structural engineer, it's just like, it's crazy. You can literally offset your own lifetime of carbon emissions pretty much if you just make a positive change on a few projects, right? Like you mentioned, transfers, sometimes unnecessary. Do we really need it? Or swapping materials out, for more sustainable ones as well, hey?
100%. And that's going back to where we've been, a backseat passenger in the decision making, and we've followed, architectural kind of intent and what a developer might want in terms of those grand open foyer spaces, an entrance to a tall building, which results, a deep transfer and a lot of embodied carbon. Well, now is the time really for us to start challenging that thought process. If we do want to reduce embodied carbon, and there are some developers now starting to think of their assets and knowing if they don't do that, there's an embodied carbon associated with it, and it's going to make a difference. I mean, just going back as well a little bit, there are some other positive signs. There's almost private industry is pushing forward change. So some of the really large infrastructure projects, which are happening everywhere in Australia, the financiers are asking for kind of legislation changes or changes to how we go about it, reducing embodied carbon beyond the legislation that exists, significantly beyond it. So kind of almost leading and connecting that to green financing. So there's various kind of levers and mechanisms that can be pulled to try and accelerate the whole process. So yeah, it's a big part of multifaceted kind of complexity of, but I think hopefully, there's collaboration, which is healthy for everyone, where we can be there at the start and helping kind of map out the embodied carbon reduction, because it happens at the start. So it's like, as timber's a great example, it needs to be understood at the front end. So the conceptualization, of that building, the selection of material, what does it mean, in terms of procurement, and getting that set up from the get-go rather than afterthought. And that's just embodied carbon in a nutshell. It's thought through from the start, and it leads all the way through to really understand the savings, because the biggest savings they're there for the taking at the front end.
100%, man. So there's a lot going on, the decarbonisation, and obviously structural engineers. It's like you got to maybe learn this stuff on the job, but there's another component which I guess is making the engineer's role evolve, and this is what's happening in the digital world. So I'd like for you to just take us through this space, and I know you've done 4D virtual design, and you're really innovating yourself in this space. So I'd like for you to just tell us tell us about what are some of the things happening there and how an engineer can add new value essentially that wasn't being able to be offered before.
Sure. On the digital side, we're pushing pretty hard. We've got an in-house team that's looking at new kind of approaches in terms of scripting, optimization, and visualization, like we touched on. Going back to what I said before about construction methodology and it being at the heart of our design, we look to visualize that in animations. So it's this kind of 3D, almost lifelike renders we're kind of getting down to now with individuals who've come from the gaming industry, and we're connecting structural analysis software such as Strand 7 directly to the program and then directly to the visualization software, so everything's interconnected. I think there's big benefits potentially with something that's modular, such as mass timber. We can highlight individual panel types, map out exact sequencing for how those panels are going to be installed, and it can really assist in greater understanding, of safety on site, how things are built, and one of the interesting things that we've been playing around with is just comparing materiality, build types, and then we can actually have multiple options side by side. We integrate a program in it to create the 4D sequencing, and we can almost pit different sequences against each other and see which one comes out on top, in terms of program being a key driver for the industry as well as complexity. So we see it as being really powerful, and we've had some pretty positive feedback in terms of complex engineering, construction. Just seeing it, in real time, just is something that conveys a message which everyone can get.
Well, it's huge, Ed, because I think listeners might know, like if you just look at the material price alone of concrete versus timber, or the traditional materials versus timber, you probably might, on price alone, it might not look so attractive. But when you actually do that installation speeds, like you're modeling up front to get that speedy construction, so you can actually work out what's our preliminary cost saving, and you can start with that data up front. You can start getting a real holistic pricing model, and then it's just going to be better for the mass timber option essentially because of that speed. And anything with that dollar per week costs, reduce it by X weeks, and there's your saving, hey?
100%. Yeah, I think we've had the discussion in the past of some of the cost consultancy and quantity surveying doesn't fully factor in program, and obviously it changes the viability of a project. If you can build something a lot quicker and you start getting a return, on that quicker delivery, then it makes a big difference to the viability of the whole project. So I think as soon as you can kind of link that and you can see it pretty clearly within a fairly short animation, then it can help get the message across. So I think it's an enabler for the timber industry, that's for sure.
Yeah, 100%, Ed. Well, it's been phenomenal chatting to you. If people want to find out more about you, the work you're doing, if they want to get in touch for you or projects, you've got a unique, I guess, brand in embodied carbon / virtual design. So it's it's a really cool position that you and your team are in at the moment. So where should people go to learn more about what we're speaking about today?
Yeah, you can follow Robert Bird Group on LinkedIn. You can go to our website as well, which is robertbird.com, and more than happy for people to get in touch with me, via LinkedIn. I'm under Edward Bond, and happy to engage. With any questions regarding what we've spoken about today. And thanks for having me on, Adam.